Vietnam has a history of resisting foreign invasions dating back thousands of years. The Chinese, the Mongols, the French, and the Japanese had all invaded and been fiercely resisted by the Vietnamese.
My father fought the French. And the French came into Vietnam and civilized the Vietnamese. And then the French chopped off rows of heads of resistant soldiers and made it into French postcards. And life under the French colonialism was terrible. So people fought on and on for 100 years to get them out. And we saw no difference between the French involvement and the American involvement here in Vietnam. Just a different slogan.
After declaring their independence from France in 1945, the Vietnamese became experts at modern war, fighting almost continuously from 1946 through 1954. The French Indochina War served as a dress rehearsal for the coming American War. For them, the American War was simply another foreign invasion that would last until the invaders left.
It's not like in 365 days they were going to climb on a plane and go somewhere else. They were from Vietnam. That was their country. They were going to be there no matter what happened to the Americans. They were either going to be there or they were going to die there.
General Nguyen Van Giap's victory over the French at Dien Bien Phu in 1954 was a great source for insights into French tactical shortcomings. It also illustrated Vietnamese tactics, as well as their patience and iron determination.
Uncle Ho instructed General Giap, if you fight, you must win. If you are sure you can win, then fight. And when General Giap came here, Ho's order of the day was, you must fight to the last person until you die.
When a French reporter asked the commanding general of the forces in Vietnam, who was the prime architect of the war, William Childs Westmoreland, said, General Westmoreland, aren't you studying the lessons of the French? And in all of his arrogance, his reply was, who is going to study anything from the French army? They haven't won a battle since Napoleon.
As early as 1941, the Indochina Communist Party, led by Ho Chi Minh, believed that there were two ways to advance a cause, by politics or by using force. This was called political or armed Đao Tram.
We didn't have the ambition to destroy an army much stronger and way better armed than ours. We wanted to fight in a way to give us a favorable condition to realize our war objectives. Fight militarily, politically, and diplomatically.
We had to leave someday. This was a war that for him was not going to be over in 5 minutes. It was a war that he had been fighting against the French for over 90 years. So what if he had to fight the Yanks for 90 years? He wasn't in that big of a hurry. We were.
Where previously in history the defeat of a nation's fighting forces meant defeat of the nation, under Đao Tram, if the army is defeated, the struggle continues politically. The nation can never be defeated as long as the will of the people remains strong.
A mother and her baby were hiding with other soldiers in a trench when the baby began to cry. To avoid giving away their position, she strangled her own child, sacrificing him to save the lives of the other soldiers.
One of the biggest debates in the war were the rules of engagement placed on the military by President Lyndon Johnson. He feared if American military operations were carried out in Laos and Cambodia, it would broaden the war, possibly provoking China to intervene.
The enemy didn't as much hide in plain sight as it did parade itself in areas that we had placed off limits to our military forces. We allowed the enemy to have sanctuaries that were extremely important to his conduct of the war.
think there's no doubt at all that when you hamstring your military and you tell them they can't move over borders even though the enemy is able to do it, then you get not only frustration and a lack of morale, you get tactical disadvantage.
You cannot win the game if you can't cross the 50-yard line. That's the story of the Vietnam War as far as I'm concerned. We had a DMZ. We had a northernmost boundary that we could not cross. And anytime we chased them hard or hit them hard, they could run across to the other side and be safe, and we couldn't chase them there. And we could send planes over to bomb them, but that's bullshit.
New information from NDA commanders confirms that an American ground attack earlier in the war would have severely disrupted the NVA supply effort in the South.
According to Nguyen Giap, at that time, North Vietnamese leaders had grave concerns. They were scared that American troops might land and attack at certain places. Then our effort to transport weapons to the South would have been disrupted. Also, a large portion of our troops would have had to remain in the North for defense. It is our priority to defend the North. Since our resources and headquarters were located there. However, for some reason, America chose not to attack.
It was President Richard Nixon who finally approved the sending of American troops into Cambodia on the 1st of May, 1970.
What should we have done? We should have rolled them up. Right up to the Chinese border. There would have been fewer boat people, there would have been fewer deaths, they'd all be riding Hondas and have color TVs and wristwatches now, the economy would be stronger, everyone would be happier. There'd be oil platforms in the China Sea, everyone would be richer and happier, you know? We wouldn't have had to go through concentration camps and re-education camps and all of that incredible bullshit. Southeast Asia would be a booming economy now.
The incursion into Cambodia bought the U.S. some time. On a tactical sense, it was successful. But at the end of the day, the Americans still faced an enemy embedded among the civil population.
The enemy asked the people, "Who feeds the Vietcong?" They asked because they did not know that the Vietcong were the people. And the people feed themselves. As simple as that.
South Vietnam was a country in name only. As a nation, South Vietnam was not even the sum of its parts. The South Vietnamese people were much like the Americans under British rule before independence.
There were a small core of people that wanted independence. There was a small core of people that wanted to support the communists. And there was a much larger group of people that merely wanted to be left alone. They wanted to farm their rice. They wanted to raise their families, much like people do everywhere. They kind of went with the ebb and flow. Whoever was in charge, whoever had the strength, whether that was the communists or the South Vietnamese, that's the side they supported.
The failure of the South Vietnamese army to be consistent in the field, due in large part to its internal corruption as well as U.S. mistrust, became evident as America sought to disengage its ground forces from the war.
Our allies were supposed to be the South Vietnamese Army, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, which wasn't a republic, but never mind. They were in a highly difficult situation. They were drafted by the South Vietnamese government, for which they did not have a great deal of respect, forced into the army and required to fight on behalf of 550,000 white people from outside their country against their own people from the north. They were in a hard place. Again, how would we feel if we were drafted to fight for an invading Asian army in Washington? We wouldn't do it. So they were half-hearted. They didn't know whose side they were on.
A country is reflected in its leadership. The invasion of Cambodia, though successful militarily for the U.S., epitomized the corruption at the top of the South Vietnamese army. Military strategies aside, the foremost reason that South Vietnam does not exist today is that it never really existed as a nation, except on paper.
As I look around, instead of seeing cannons being taken out of these supply depots and flown back to Saigon as war trophies, I saw Mercedes-Benzes. I saw nets slung under helicopters with cows in it going back to the butcher shops, because the senior leadership of the South Vietnamese armies were not generals, they were businessmen.
There's a saying that only those willing to die for their country are fit to rule it. The government of South Vietnam had become insupportable. That was the main reason why the communists were able to exterminate it.
I think if you wanted me to characterize the South Vietnamese military political system, I'd say it was corrupt, it was inefficient, it was badly trained, and it relied too much upon its American allies. There's no doubt that many generals are more interested in the uniforms they were wearing rather than the military tactics.
The North Vietnamese suffered 2 million military deaths, 3 times that many wounded, 150,000 civilian dead, and 300,000 men still listed as missing.
If it was a war of survival for the United States, it would have been completely different, but it wasn't. It was a war of survival, perhaps for the North Vietnamese, and they certainly took it that way, and that's why in the end, I think they won.
The American cost of war in South Vietnam was tens of billions of dollars and over 58,000 military dead, with 4 times that number wounded and over 2,000 still missing in action.
I would say that the insurgent had a great many advantages. And the main advantage was that he had the support of the preponderance of the people of South Vietnam. They fed him, they provided him with intelligence, they gave him their sons, they gave him their daughters to be warriors. They were fully supportive of the war, as opposed to the American soldier that was in Vietnam, whose support base back home was saying, hey, LBJ, how many did you kill today?
South Vietnam reportedly lost over 1 million soldiers and at least that many civilian deaths. There's no estimate on their missing.
Vietnam represents the war between 2 opposite worlds. Communism versus Western democracy. Since back then, the world is divided into 2 sides. One is led by America, the other by the Soviet Union. As a result of the world's history and situation, North Vietnam ends up on the Soviet side, and South Vietnam belongs to the American side. So I now see us as victims of the world's historical events, and we end up fighting against ourselves.
The story is told of an American Army colonel in his encounter with a senior North Vietnamese official at the Paris peace negotiations. When the American commented, "You know, you never beat us on the battlefield," the communist official replied without a pause, "That may be true, but it is also irrelevant." Invisible in the jungle, shielded by the arrogance of their enemy and enduring losses beyond all comprehension, the NVA and VC had hidden themselves in plain sight. 10 years after American troops landed at Da Nang, 21 years after the French were defeated at Dien Bien Phu, the Indochina-Vietnam Wars were